Morning. My name is Carlos Rodriguez. I serve as the Executive Officer for the Building Industry Association, Southern California's Baldy chapter. I would like to welcome you to the 2020 Southern California Housing Policy Conference, presented by the Building Industry Association of Southern California and featuring informative panels from our BIA chapters, Baldy, LA Ventura, Orange County, and Riverside. A special thanks to my BIA chapter colleagues, Diana Coronado, Steve Lamont, and Lou Monville, for their significant contributions to the conference. Before we start, I'd like to take a moment to thank our generous sponsors. Our energy efficiency education sponsors, Southern California Edison and Southern California Gas Company. Our American Standard sponsor, the County of San Bernardino. Our American Dream sponsors, the Citrus Valley Association of Realtors, Loan Depot, Lewis Group of Companies, Pacific Communities, and Tapestry. Our American Ideal sponsors, Brookville Residential, Boudreaux Pipeline Corporation, CDS Insurance, Crestwood Communities, David Evans and Associates, Lennar, Richmond American Homes, United Engineering Group. And our government partners, the City of Chino Hills, the City of Ontario, and the City of Victorville. Thank you so much for your generosity in helping to make this conference become a reality. The Building Industry Association of Southern California is a leading advocate for thousands of building industry leaders who are committed to a better future for California by building communities, creating jobs, and ensuring housing opportunities for everyone. As such, we appreciate the ongoing opportunity to collaborate with you to address our chronic housing crisis and help attain the goals set forth by the upcoming sixth cycle of the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, or RHNA, allocation plan, which will require 1.3 million new homes in the SCAG region over a 7-year period beginning in 2022. This is an increase from approximately 400,000 homes in the current fifth cycle of RHNA. We're excited about today's program, which is designed to provide elected leaders with policy solutions that will better position cities to attain their RHNA state obligations. Before we move forward, I want to thank the elected officials and staff and just for your continued collaboration with the BIA and our members to ensure that our essential service of home construction continued during this pandemic. We understand it's been a historic challenge for cities and all levels of government, and we understand that without you, we would not have been able to have the predictability that we've enjoyed during these difficult times to ensure that we could provide the essential service of new homes and opportunities for individuals at all socioeconomic levels. So thank you. We look forward to discussing a variety of topics, including best practices on VMT reduction, hosted by the Baldy and Riverside chapters, a BIA Orange County perspective on RHNA compliance. Our friends at SoCal Edison will help us examine clean energy home benefits and barriers. Our BIA LA Ventura chapter will host a discussion on inclusionary housing, and our feature panel will discuss the state of housing in 2020 and beyond, and include the CEOs for the California BIA, California Apartment Association, and the California Realtors Association. Before we begin our series of panels, I'd like to introduce San Bernardino County Board of Supervisors Chairman Kurt Hagman to provide some welcome remarks. But first, a little bit about Supervisor Hagman. He was elected to serve the San Bernardino County's 4th District in November of 2014 and was named Chairman of the Board of Supervisors in January 2019. The 4th District includes the cities of Chino Hills, Montclair, Ontario, and the southern portions of Upland. Supervisor Hagman has an extensive resume of public service prior to his election to the San Bernardino County Board of Supervisors that included serving in Chino Hills as a Park and Recreation Commissioner, as a member of the City Council, Mayor, and 6 years in the California Legislature. On a personal note, I want to thank Supervisor Hagman and the Board of Supervisors for their collaboration with our industry in ensuring, again, that we had reliability and predictability in the entitlement process, and also for the leadership of the county being the first county in our region to request that the VMT requirement under SB 743 be delayed back in July. Thank you for your leadership, Supervisor Hagman, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Carlos. And what a strange year 2020 is going to be. It's going to be one that we all remember for a long time. I've been to this conference before where generally we get the opportunity to meet together, but we're hopeful that in this format, maybe even have a bigger audience. But I want to thank you all for attending the 2020 Southern California Housing Policy Conference. We appreciate your attendance and commitment to the American dream of home ownership. We believe that providing housing at all social economic levels is important. This is an issue that impacts everyone. Now, over at SCAG, Southern California Association of Governments, we as elected leaders are dealing with the numbers, the RHNA numbers that everyone puts down to the local entities, but the numbers are very high, and it's for a good reason, because housing is in a crisis right now. It's becoming harder for our children and grandchildren to live in our state. The public policies in California and anti-growth sentiment from a vocal minority are making it increasingly harder to build enough entry-level housing stock for families that make well over $80,000, including my kids who are looking themselves. Realtors will tell you that there's not enough housing available, and bidding wars are driving up the costs. Many are finding themselves locked out of today's housing market, and we're not building enough low-income transitional housing for families and seniors. Today, we ask that every county and city make solving our chronic housing shortage a top priority as we continue the daily focus on dealing with the challenges of COVID-19. We all know that the home construction and sales are recognized by the governor as essential service. We have to adopt the way we do things now even differently, which makes even more of a case for us to keep building our homes here. Likewise, we fail to address our housing shortage and prices continue to climb, the families will need to devote even more of their income to rent. Our housing crisis even affects our education. We cannot remain a state mirrored in household overcrowding, where too often we find 3 and 4 families jammed into a home. A recent study by Cal State San Bernardino suggests household overcrowding has a direct impact on the education attainment, especially among minorities. Residents of the Golden State are suffering from a lack of housing availability and housing affordability that will continue to drive more and more families into poverty and to the open arms of neighboring states with reasonable housing costs. The goal of today's conference is to break down the silos, explore more opportunities where the public and private sectors can work together to address the housing crisis facing our state. Again, I want to thank you all for joining, and thank you for committing to building homes for our residents here in San Bernardino County and abroad. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you, Supervisor, and please extend our gratitude to your colleagues for your continued leadership in helping to address this housing crisis.
Thank you.
Well, at this time, I'd like to begin kicking off our series of panels. I'm really excited about our first panel, and as I mentioned earlier this year in July, a historic piece of legislation went into effect with Senate Bill 743, beginning implementation at every city in California. The focus of SB 743 is a reduction in vehicle miles traveled. And for today's panel discussion on best practices of implementation, I'd like to welcome our moderator, Sandipan Bhattacharjee with Translutions, and he'll go ahead and introduce our panel. Take it away. Thanks, Sandipan.
Thanks, Carlos. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Baldy and Riverside chapter panel. Today, we will discuss the implications of Senate Bill 743, or SB 743. SB 743 was signed by the governor in 2013 and directed the governor's Office of Planning and Research to identify alternative metrics for evaluating transportation impacts under CEQA. Under this, the criteria for developing the significance of transportation impacts must promote the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, development of multimodal transportation networks, and a diversity of land uses. The OPR decided that VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, is the most appropriate measure to evaluate transportation impacts. So instead of measuring delay, which we now do, The impacts are determined by how far people from a development are driving. The OPR released technical advisories to calculate VMT, and as part of that, many jurisdictions are following the technical advisory, which requires an analysis with potential impacts for any development over 11 single-family homes. Our panel today is comprised of individuals who are working with this, and we have members of 2 jurisdictions that have bucked the trend to make the thresholds more development friendly, and are among the first ones to go in with screening thresholds that are 10 times higher or more than what the state advises. We have Scott Webb from the city of Victorville and Kevin Tsang from the county of Riverside. We also have Phil Burum from DR Horton, who brings in the developer's perspective. And I'm Sandipan, everybody calls me Sandy, with Translutions, and we work with agencies and developers to prepare such analysis. With that, I'll ask the panelists for any introductory remarks. Scott?
Thank you, Sandipan. Good morning, everyone. I just want to start up by thanking the BIA for organizing this forum. It's great to get the development community and local jurisdictions together to tackle these emerging issues that the state's laid out for us to tackle. So I just want to give a brief overview of our community and the VMT thresholds that we've adopted. Victorville is a growing community. We're over 125,000 in population. We have a large amount of our residents that commute over 30 miles to work every day. And roughly half of our community in the incorporated area is undeveloped. So the implications of SB 743 could be quite drastic on our community. We're also a very pro-growth community. We're also competing in the region to bring jobs and housing to the city. We've established the VMT thresholds. We started off by having a workshop with our planning commission, which ultimately recommended these thresholds for city council adoption at our June 23rd city council meeting. So the information is available online if anyone wants to pull our information on how we devised these thresholds. But in a nutshell, we wanted to make sure that we are reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's the full intent of SB 743. And it also gives us the flexibility to create our own thresholds. We created the thresholds based off our own regional air quality management district and what they consider a significant impact based on CO2 emissions. So we took that threshold of CO2 emissions and translated it into a vehicle trip count. And that gave us a total square footage for industrial, commercial, maximum units of single family homes. So it did up the current threshold that OPR's guidance provided. But within the statute, we're completely allowed to do something like this. And I'm just happy to be here, happy to share our journey, and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Scott. Kevin?
Yes, I'm Kevin Tsang. I'm a senior civil engineer with the Riverside County Transportation Department. Thank you for the BIA for inviting me to be here today to share the status that the Riverside County has in terms of compliance with SB 743. The county is, this current status is the county has draft guidelines that are approaching our board sometime in December. We've gotten off to a late start in implementing guidelines. The state requirement is in effect as of July, but what we've been doing in the meantime is working with developers with our draft guidelines. It's more of a formality right now to get it approved at our board, but we've been working with developers as of July to come into compliance with SB 743. Very similar to what Victorville has done is we've taken a look at ways to expand the screening methods for land development projects. We've taken a look at common land uses that come into the county. So subdivisions, office, warehousing. These seem to be the most common land development projects in the county. So what we've done is taken the same or similar approach that Victorville has done and looked at greenhouse gas modeling as a way of expanding the thresholds for screening out land development projects. So that'll be in our guidelines that are approaching our board again sometime in December. With the questions later on in this panel, I hope to address anything that the members have questions on.
Thanks, Kevin. Phil?
Hi, good morning. I'm Phil Burum with Horton, the immediate past president of the Baldy chapter of the Building Industry Association of Southern California. Currently sit on the governing board for BIA Southern California. I think I'm here just to give a little bit of the industry perspective and a little feedback on how VMT might be affecting land purchasing and home building decisions. So as a precursor to any conversations we might have, please know that it does. When we're looking at a new piece of property to potentially build on, market demand obviously drives the conversation, but obstacles related to planning, entitlements, development, construction also play a part in that. So as we start looking at cities, especially as we branch out from the core cities in the Inland Empire, where my division resides, we'll be paying attention to cities like Victorville that have higher thresholds that avoid the screening processes. VMT is just an unknown. I know we're going to talk a little bit about the adoption of the policy today and whether or not, and what everybody feels about whether it's legitimate or not, or the right approach to vehicle impacts. But to adopt the policy before a real mitigation plan is in place just puts mystery on development. And home builders don't like mystery. We like predictability. Costs are certainly an issue, and it's going to, and any financial impacts will drive up the cost of housing in our region. But more than that, right now, since we're in the state of not knowing what mitigation is, it's the mystery behind the predictability of entitlements. I don't think that we have that right now, and that's going to slow down entitlement process and make things less desirable to entitle. So glad we're having this discussion. Look forward to hearing Scott and Kevin's feedback and any of the audience conversation. So, but I appreciate being here. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. So, Kevin, Scott, when we first started our conversation about this, every jurisdiction was looking at the OPR recommended threshold of 11 single-family homes. And, what ended up happening is the screening thresholds that you adopted, they're significantly higher. Victorville's threshold is 136 single-family units, and the county uses a threshold of 110 single-family units, which is, for the county, it's 10 times, and for Victorville, it's almost over 13 times what the state is recommending. So what was going through your minds when you adopted these thresholds? Scott?
Here, Sandipan. So initially, we thought that actually a vast majority of our development would require an EIR, an environmental impact report, and not knowing how to mitigate these issues, we thought that, most of the EIRs would probably have to have statements of overriding consideration, since we don't know how to mitigate some of these VMT issues right now. So that's initially, we were just shook by the fact that we would need to be telling the development community that this could be a restriction that slows the process. But as we dove into it, we realized that the statute does allow for jurisdictions to create their own thresholds based on substantial evidence. So we started walking down that process and realizing that with our city council adoption of these these thresholds, we were able to give some cover to some of the smaller developments within the city, and allow them to avoid the uncertainty of the environmental process, especially during this infancy period where, as Phil was mentioning, there is no real mitigation plan right now. So we'd kind of be throwing the development community through this environmental process without knowing, key mitigation measures that will hopefully be ironed out in the coming years. But right now, it's very uncertain.
Great, thank you. Kevin, any?
Yeah, I think all local jurisdictions are kind of grappling with this. The guidance that came out of OPR were really limiting. I think that they were tailored more to urbanized areas. And Riverside County has a large amount of area that's undeveloped. And so with the 100 daily trips as the threshold from OPR, that really translated to just 11 single family dwelling units. Most of the subdivisions in the county exceed this. There are very few developments that are going to go with 11 single family dwelling units. So we're of the same mind. We didn't want all projects to all of a sudden go from doing a negative declaration or MND to an EIR for a simple subdivision. So we looked at the guidance, we looked at statute, and yes, there's allowances for jurisdictions to develop or expand on the compliance with VMT and SB 743, demonstrating through substantial evidence. So we used CaliMod to determine the GHG numbers that for our air quality basin, what our thresholds are for each of the common uses that I mentioned before, the single family office and warehousing developments that we have. So those screening thresholds have been placed in our guidance and allow for developments to use those rather than the 110 daily trips.
Great, thank you. Val.
And if I could piggyback on that, one of the things that I think a lot of cities maybe and agencies didn't know or didn't take the time to investigate. I'm thinking back to our VMT Roadshow that Carlos organized for us earlier this year, trying to help cities understand what the adoption processes were. I don't think that a lot of cities really went through the data. They looked at the press release and adopted the OPR standards, as opposed to understanding the intent and the letter of the law, which the goal is to reduce GHG and VMT impacts. So there are several hundreds of ways to do that. So just from a building industry perspective, and then and the piggyback on that is, as I understand it, they can revise their, just because they adopted something July 1st doesn't mean it's fixed in stone.
Correct.
So they can revise their standards. So, but I just want it from the building industry's perspective, thank Kevin and Scott for kind of leading that conversation and adopting certainly a more reasonable threshold. I would have preferred 500, but we appreciate you guys stretching out to the ones.
Thanks, Phil. So when we are doing analysis and a project doesn't screen out, what we are seeing is in about 60–70% of the cases, there are significant impacts when a project doesn't screen out. And since mitigation measures are so rare, an EIR is the only way for a project to go forward. So Phil, how does it affect your land acquisition decisions?
I will jokingly say it stops them. But more realistically, there'd have to be a really compelling reason to open that can of worms for us. D.R. Horton's primarily a merchant builder. More and more we're doing our own entitlement, just as finished lots become absorbed. But when you're looking, and if I'm looking at Victorville and I have an option to buy a 80 unit subdivision or a 300 unit potential subdivision, I'm probably going to avoid the 300 unit one. And I only say Victorville just because we have their numbers right in front of us. Not having that known and knowing that I could be susceptible to that mitigation if it's ever adopted in 2 years if I'm still building out the project. Makes us lean towards jurisdictions that have a higher threshold and a more predictable process. So it definitely impacts it. I won't say it stops it, but it's just another cost that's unquantifiable, which makes it scary.
So then with that, a follow-up for Scott and Kevin, how, based on what Phil just said, how does it affect your jurisdiction's competitiveness in terms of the RENA allocations and what you have to build? Scott?
Thanks, Sandipan. So yeah, it's just another factor that we have to consider when we're going through this process right now of site inventory, preparing for updating our housing elements. And when we factor in the 8,000 units that we're supposed to build in Victorville over the next 8 years, we have to look at the feasibility of each site. So whether that's VMT or whether that's a site that has Western Joshua trees on it, these are all things now that we have to factor in on whether or not this is a viable site that will be built on. So it complicates the issue and makes it harder to achieve our RENA numbers.
Kevin, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so the RENA is handled by our planning department, but it does add another layer that needs to be considered when we update the numbers and the housing element. One thing that I think could be considered is you have the small project screening that we've been talking about, the number of units, but there's another screening method, the map-based screening, and that's going to vary by jurisdiction, just depending on what comes out of the tool that the jurisdiction uses. So taking a look at map-based screening is also another thing that that would be part of that exercise. And so competitiveness wise, I think every jurisdiction is going to be grappling with this as they consider VMT and the RENA numbers.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. So, the intent of 743 was to make urban infill development easier because those areas have more transit options and generally lower VMT. But with the current pandemic, people are moving out to the more suburban areas, which is opposite of what the intent of 743 was. So I'd like to see what your thoughts are. And then again, with follow-up question later on for Phil would be, COVID-19 and the work from home scenario has taken out a large component of daily VMT by reducing commute trips. So how is it affecting development in terms of overall planning of a development and site selection and all that? So whoever wants to can go first, I guess.
Lacking it first, I'll get mine out of the way. One of the challenges we have with VMT and understanding it and the modeling that exists is all the modeling is based on information over the last 10 or 20 years. COVID changed the story.
Mm-hmm.
So I just find it difficult to believe any VMT model for daily trips has any accuracy at all. I know as an industry, we pushed very hard for the governor to consider delaying the adoption of this, not only because there was no regional mitigation plans in place, but also because COVID's resetting the mark. So I think it's difficult to rely on the VMT modeling for how you're going to plan for mitigation. But in answer to the question you have regarding work from home is, I think most home builders have been trending towards providing workspace in their floor plans. There might be more of a focus now, whereas before you would call that fourth room a bedroom because bedroom count's so important. Maybe you're calling it a den or an office now. The internal living space is crucial for homeowners. So finding a way to make sure that the homes are all suited for modern technology and providing the space needed for those that can work from home. We've heard some studies that say 20% of the workforce is never going back. In the long-term projections, it could be as high as 40 or 50. So we're certainly preparing for it. Our floor plans and most builders think have adopted to that work from home strategy. I'm just curious to see how the VMT modeling is revised to account for that.
Scott, Kevin?
Well, yeah, VMT. With COVID, I don't think the models are really factoring that in. I think the beginning part of your question was with SB 7443 and trying to get people to move to infill development, and the opposite's occurring. I think it's a little early to tell. This just in this area, I think it went into effect July for most jurisdictions in Riverside County, and so time will tell what happens, what the trends will be. But I think telework and telecommuting, they are having an effect on decisions for developers. And certainly that'll come up in mitigation too, because we are allowing some reduction in VMT numbers that developers can take for mitigation. The issue with that is there's not a lot of studies published about the effectiveness and the reductions that teleworking has on VMT. So I think it's just a matter of time when more information comes out about what 743 is going to do and what COVID is doing to development.
Scott, I take a moment to, attendees, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them on the Q&A tab, which should be right next to the participants screen. So Scott, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, certainly COVID hasn't slowed down our single family development growth in Victorville. It was trending upward before the pandemic, but it's even more so now. We're lucky that we have still some recorded maps that were left over from the last housing boom. So developers can easily go in there. They don't have to go through, a new environmental entitlement process. We are working with developers that have, unentitled property that are working through the tentative map process. But that's a little bit slower now due to these emerging standards, having to factor in the VMTs. So eventually our recorded maps will dry up, and we need to have a large inventory of tentative maps that have already gone through that environmental review, so we can keep supplying the demand that's needed for housing.
Thank you. Now, so as we talked about earlier, and Kevin also mentioned, there are currently very few defensible mitigation measures. So do you think the implementation was rushed and California should have waited until more studies were prepared to identify costs associated with these mitigation measures? I'll maybe start with Phil.
Yes. Leave to the smart people to explain why, but this is one of those, was it the road to hell was paved with good intentions? I think it's a well-intentioned theory, but rushed, yes. It's an unquantifiable cost, which is never a good thing. So I'll leave it to smart people to explain why.
Kevin?
I don't know if I have a good explanation. Just to answer the question, I think, California's, it varies widely depending on where you are. And I think the mitigation for the jurisdiction depending on where it is in California, will vary as well. So the guidance document is kind of generic in its formatting of what is applicable mitigation for VMT reduction. And I don't think it recognizes the uniqueness that jurisdictions have, the challenges it may face trying to implement transit. So I think more guidance on for mitigation that's more inclusive of these type of challenges that jurisdictions may face, or just even developing jurisdictions. Not all jurisdictions have the ability to implement transit. And that's one of the big components for screening and on the mitigation side. So I think a bigger list or a bigger consideration should have been given to that piece of the legislation.
Great, thanks. Scott, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'd just like to state, even though our city was able to adopt thresholds before the implementation of this SB 743, our city council also adopted, along with other jurisdictions, a resolution to the state to ask for a delay. Obviously, that delay wasn't granted for an implementation, but we had concerns that we voiced to our city council when this was all adopted, and it's mainly because of the mitigation measures. As Phil was saying, they're not quantifiable right now. We don't know which ones are viable, which ones are defensible.
Right.
And it's going to take some time.
Yeah, thanks. So again, lastly, you have been trailblazers in moving away from the stringent OPR recommendation. So what would be your recommendation to other jurisdictions that are either yet to adopt thresholds or have adopted the default OPR recommendations as thresholds? What would be your recommendations to those jurisdictions? Scott?
Sure, I'll lead off. I just want to make sure that the cities understand that they have the discretion. It's not something that you have to follow the OPR's technical guidance. You obviously have to adopt your own threshold. It has to be based on substantial evidence. But yeah, the technical advisory is just a baseline. And it's going to add to the unpredictability of the CEQA process. If you don't adopt guidelines that provide a higher threshold, you're going to subject more of your development community to that uncertainty. And it also impacts your competitiveness. You know, if your neighboring city has higher thresholds, you may lose development just because of that, because that developer may want to, or they may see a more certain path with a neighboring jurisdiction.
Thank you. Kevin, do you have anything to add to that?
I echo what Scott said. Local jurisdictions should evaluate OPR guidance, and then take a look at how complying with that and balancing it with fulfilling the general plan vision, goals, and policies for the jurisdiction. There will be things that have to be looked at very carefully, as well as just making sure that development can continue. As Scott said, you have neighboring jurisdictions that will be facing these same decisions, and you do not want to find yourself too far off the common path and make it difficult for developments. So it's a balance that the jurisdiction is going to have to strike between the vision they have for themselves and complying with the legislation.
So Phil, anything from the developer's perspective?
Yeah, just be as brief as possible. I just think that the housing industry, this is just another example of how we are asked to fill a mission to provide housing for the citizens of the state, but one more thing, we're being punished for doing so. The housing industry has to do inclusionary and affordable housing fees in some jurisdiction. There's no other industry on the planet that has to subsidize itself. This is one where if I wanted to build 10 homes in Barstow, and I'm going to spend $200,000 a home, but because of VMT, or 12 homes, sorry, beats the threshold, and I'm going to spend $200,000 per home, you can't tell me as an agency whether my mitigation is going to be another $2,000, $5,000, $10,000, or $20,000. Why would I build? So it's just another example of, again, I get the logic of the VMT threshold, but rushing it into legislation without a real mitigation plan that makes sense is just disheartening for the industry. So
thanks, Phil. So again, to summarize again, thank you everybody on this panel, Phil, Scott, Kevin. Summarizing what we are hearing is this just adds to a little bit of uncertainty. And again, partially it's because we are used to dealing with level of service. And if something doesn't work, we add a lane or do something and that gets fixed. But in case of VMT, again, there are no real mitigation measures. And again, one of the things that we are seeing is also as practitioners that we are doing a lot of due diligence studies before land acquisition, and to figure out that, hey, do I need, I'm trying to build, let's say 30 homes, do I need to do any IR? And that uncertainty is what's affecting our industry. It's affecting home building and home affordability. So with that, I'll, since I don't see any questions from the audience, I'll turn it over to Carlos.
Thanks, Sandipan, and what a great job by the panel. I wish we had virtual applause. We're going to work on that for next time, but great job. I think a takeaway for elected officials, city council members, city managers, and staff is that there's flexibility. And as to the challenge of getting a VMT ordinance implemented by July, we found that quite often there was just a default to go with that OPR threshold, but clearly there is a pathway to a legally defensible alternative that's based on data and can allow for an exemption range that could be from the current 11 units, but upwards to 100 to 200 units. No two cities are alike, and it does take revisiting the topic, but one takeaway today is that there's an opportunity to revisit that issue. It would certainly provide tremendous relief in many cases, and also ensure that there's compliance that remains for each city. We stand ready at the BIA to work as partners in collaboration with every city to ensure that we revisit this important issue of VMT implementation, not only on the exemption opportunities that are highlighted by Kevin and Scott, but also moving forward to the all-important issues related to mitigation and how that looks. So we're gonna have to roll up our sleeves and work together on that. It's gonna be as important of an issue for the industry to be able to do our part in coordination with you all at a city level to help meet that RENA obligation. So we'll look forward to that opportunity. Thanks so much for the insights shared on this panel. And with that, we're going to segue to our next panel here in just a few minutes. I'll have a introduction for that panel with just about 2 minutes and counting. So we'll just have our momentary pause in case you wanted to run over and get some coffee and come on back, stretch your legs, and we'll be back here momentarily. Thanks. As we continue to thank our sponsors, again, I'll just remind all of our attendees that our next panel will be coming up at 9:45, just a moment here, and we'll do that introduction. Thank you.